Martin Luther King and Malcolm X, more alike than different. In today's society there are many people we owe our thanks for the contributions they made to our society. For some, it can be difficult to distinguish fact from fiction when appreciating historical events which have shaped our current world, especially regarding events and people who could be considered controversial or have held controversial views for their time, but then again, very few find themselves written in the pages of history by acting as a moderate. For the better part of history, it has been due to the efforts of those willing to challenge the status quo and question conventional wisdom that we have advanced to the degree we have today. The extremists of today are the ones who forge the future of tomorrow. Such extreme people are Malcolm X and Martin Luther King. To the common observer of history, at first glance these two men could be mistaken as polar opposites that have no unifying attributes other than the status of radical assigned to them due to the views they held at that junction in time. This cannot be further from the truth. In reality, these two are more similar than different with regards to the philosophical and moral principles they strived for, two of those being the belief in human dignity and equality. These were not two men who differed in their intended goals, as many people today tend to believe, but by the means in which said goals would be reached. When discussing historical figures and events, it can be important to remember that all ideas should be judged by the principles of those ideas, and not by the means in which an individual intends on reaching them. This helps to keep the observer of history in a position of unbiased and objective analysis, rather than aligning himself with historical figures he may or may not favor. With this in mind, Malcolm X and Martin Luther King are very much the same with regards to the goals in which they were aiming to achieve, which was the full recognition of the rights of African Americans. With elaboration, I would like to explain the reason behind these statements. On one hand, we have Martin Luther King, who was not only famous for his activism on behalf of African American rights in America, but he was also famous, or rather, he was infamous for his criticisms of the Vietnam War during his later years. Martin Luther King was a man who wasn't one to hold his tongue, and used his prestige to voice the hypocrisy of the United States, having a mere few years ago advised blacks in America to use diplomacy in times of conflict but would not abide by those same demands during their own times of conflict. Malcolm X was also known for his criticisms of the foreign policy of the United States, many criticisms which remain true to this very day. Like Martin, he was not shy in his criticism of how the United States allowed Patrice Lumumba, a democratically elected Prime Minister of the Congo, to be assassinated because it served the United States' foreign interest. Like Martin, he remained vigilante even when criticized and asserted that we as a country should abide by the same rules we expect of others. Both he and Martin believed that it was to the betterment of mankind that problems be solved through diplomacy if possible, and not to immediately resort to violence. Though perhaps what Martin Luther King was most commonly known throughout the entire world was his pursuit of civil rights in America. Martin Luther King was an extremely religious figure, a devout Christian, who used Christianity as a tool of activism by challenging the discrimination of blacks with the religious values he held, and for many, he stands as a shining example of what can be achieved when Christian values are embraced. His use of traditional Christian values, along with some inspiration from and the famous Hindu religious figure Mahatma Gandhi, helped equip him with the tools necessary to orchestrate the March on Washington, an historical event where whites and blacks protested nonviolently for the rights of black Americans. Another example of King exemplifying traditional Christian values was during his famous speech, "I Have a Dream." In this speech, he expresses his wish for white children and black children to live together in unity, which is reminiscent of the Christian Bible's teachings that all men have a duty to love their neighbor. The argument could also be made that he expressed his deeply held belief in Christianity when he stated that hate cannot drive out hate, only love can do that, which is reminiscent of Jesus and his assertion that people should love each other despite their sins. Like Martin Luther King, Malcolm X was an extremely religious figure who used his religious beliefs as a tool for the advocacy for black rights in America, though with Islam in his case. Rather than adopting traditional Christian values like Martin Luther King had, Malcolm X adopted a mantra already well established in the Muslim world, which was the idea that it was better to die fighting an enemy than to suffer under tyrannical oppression, or persecution is worse than slaughter. Sanctioned by the religion of Islam, he advocated for a nonviolent solution but for self-defense to be used on the behalf of blacks in matters which required it, conflicting with Martin Luther King's idea of complete nonviolent resistance. In both instances, these men exemplify the attribute in which their paternal religious figures exemplified, with Martin Luther King exemplifying the kind-hearted nature traditionally associated with Jesus, and Malcolm X exemplifying the courageous attributes traditionally associated with the Prophet Muhammad. What made Martin Luther King such a revered figure in the history of the United States, and what also led to the eventual success of his campaign for the rights of African Americans was his deep-seated belief that all men were created equal, which was primarily due to his Christian influence. Passages in the Bible such as when Jesus declared "He who hath not sinned cast the first stone" is a recurring mantra in the Christian religion and sets all men on the same grounds of respect and dignity. His beliefs in Christianity allowed him to forgive those who had done African Americans wrong and to use love to bring former enemies together. Like Martin, Malcolm's deep-seated belief in Islam, a religion which doesn't recognize a separation of races, led him to be a strong believer that all human life was equal. While Malcolm X was certainly critical of whites, and even derogatory in some cases, he always maintained that all life was equal, regardless of the color, and although much of what he said was extremely controversial, rude, and sometimes flat-out wrong, he always maintained that he believed that all men were created equal and should embrace peace if possible. It was especially during his later years when he saw the errors in his disdain for whites that his and Martin's beliefs began to come to a crossroads, even leading to the two meeting in some instances. Perhaps the greatest similarity between these two men was their profound insight that taught the world that great hardship must be met with an even greater fight to persevere, that we shouldn't learn to deal with life by ignoring the parts we don't like, because in the process of ignoring we justify what ought not to be justified. It is because of the advocacy of these two men the world was able to adopt a sound, logical, and moral idea of what justice should look like, and that it should be a concept which benefits all. Despite obvious differences with regards to their personalities and religious beliefs, their ideals remain as the universal ideals of justice and equality that we abide by to this day, and their names forever lay in the pages of history along with others who have dedicated their lives to help humanity progress to a more just world.